Section 4 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 28. Francis I and Charles V, Part 4. Before the death of Maximilian, and when neither party had done more than foresee the struggle and get ready for it, Francis I was, for some time, able to hope for some success. 7 German princes, 3 ecclesiastical and 4 laic, the archbishops of Mayence, Cologne, and Troves, and the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the King of Bohemia, had the sole power of electing the emperor. 4 of them, the Archbishop of Troves and of Cologne, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the Margrave of Brandenburg, had favorably received the overtures of Francis I, and had promised him their suffrages. His devoted servant, Robert de la Marck, Lord of Fleuranges, had brought to him at Amboise a German gentleman from the Palatinate, Franz von Sickingen, of a very petty family, but a very gentle companion, says Fleuranges, the most beautiful talker that I think I ever saw in my life, and in so much that there was no gentleman in Germany, prince or man of war, who would not have been glad to do him pleasure. Francis I had received him with very chivalrous grace, and had given him a pension of 3,000 livres and handsome presents for his comrades in adventure, and Sickingen was so charmed that he said to Fleuranges on leaving Amboise, "The king did not open his heart to me on the subject of the empire. However, I know all about it, and I beg you to tell him that I will do his service and keep the oath I gave him." A more important personage than Sickingen, Leo X, would have been very glad to have for emperor in Germany neither the King of France nor the King of Spain, both of them being far too powerful in Europe, and far too emulous in Italy, not to be dangerous enemies or inconvenient allies for him, and he tried to dissuade Francis I from making any claim to the empire, and induce him to employ his influence in bringing about the election of a second-rate German prince, Frederick the Wise, Duke of Saxony, who was justly popular in Germany, and who would never be in a condition to do France any harm. It was judicious advice and a policy good for France as well as for Europe in general, but Francis I, infatuated by his desire and his hope, did not relish it at all, and Leo X, being obliged to choose between the two great claimants, declared for Francis I without any pleasure or confidence, but also without any great perplexity, for he had but little faith in the success which he made a show of desiring. Francis, deceived by these appearances and promises, on the part both of ecclesiastics and laics, held language breathing a gallant and almost careless confidence. "We are not enemies, your master and I," he said to the ambassadors of Spain. "We are two lovers courting the same mistress. Whichever of the two she may prefer, the other will have to submit, and harbor no resentment." But when, shortly after Maximilian's death, the struggle became closer and the issue nearer, the inequality between the forces and changes of the two rivals became quite manifest, and Francis I could no longer affect the same serenity. He had entrusted the management of his affairs in Germany to a favorite comrade of his early youth, Admiral de Bonnevet, a soldier and a courtier, witty, rash, sumptuous, eager to display his master's power and magnificence. Charles of Austria's agents, and at their head his Aunt Margaret, who had the government of the Low Countries in his absence, were experienced, deliberate, discreet, more eager to succeed in their purpose than to make a brilliant appearance, and resolved to do quietly whatever was necessary for success. And to do so they were before long as fully authorized as they were resolved. They discovered that Francis I had given Bonnevet 400,000 crowns in gold that he might endeavor to bribe the electors. It was, according to report, double the sum Charles of Austria had promised for the same object, and his agent sent him information of it, and received this answer: "We are wholly determined to spare nothing and to stake all for all upon it, as the matter we most desire, and have most at heart in this world. The election must be secured, whatever it may cost me." The question before the 7 elective princes who were to dispose of the empire was thenceforth merely which of the two claimants would be the higher and the safer bidder. Francis I engaged in a tussle of wealth and liberality with Charles of Austria. One of his agents wrote to him, All will go well if we can fill the maw of the Margrave Joachim of Brandenburg. He and his brother the Elector from Mayence fall every day into deeper depths of avarice. We must hasten to satisfy them with speed, speed, speed." Francis I replied, "I will have Marquis Joachim gorged at any price," and he accordingly made over to him in ready money and bills of short dates all that was asked for by the Margrave, who on the 8th of April 1519 gave a written undertaking to support the candidature of the most invincible and most Christian prince, Francis, by the grace of God King of the French, Duke of Milan and Lord of Genoa, who, what with his vigorous age, his ability, his justice, his military experience, the brilliant fortune of his arms, and all other qualities required for war and the management of the Commonwealth, surpasses, in the judgment of every one, all other Christian princes. But Charles of Austria did not consider himself beaten because 2 of the 7 electors displayed avarice and venality. His Aunt Margaret and his principal agent in Germany, the Chamberlain Amherstolf, resumed financial negotiations with the Archbishop of Mayence, for his brother the Margrave as well as for himself, and the Archbishop, without any formal engagement, accepted the Austrian overbid. "I am ashamed at his shamelessness," wrote Amherstolf to Charles. Alternate and antagonistic bargaining went on thus for more than 2 months. The Archbishop of Cologne, Hermann von Wade, kept wavering between the 2 claimants, but he was careful to tell John d'Albret, Francis I's agent, that he sincerely hoped that His Majesty would follow the doctrine of God, who gave as much to those who went to work in his vineyard towards the middle of the day as those who had been at it all the morning. Duke Frederick of Saxony was the only one of the 7 electors who absolutely refused to make any promise, as well as to accept any offer, and preserved his independence as well as his dignity. The rumour of all these traffickings and all these uncertainties rekindled in Henry VIII, King of England, a fancy for placing himself once more in the ranks, but his agent, Richard Pace, found the negotiations too far advanced and the prices too high for him to back up this vain whim of his master's, and Henry VIII abandoned it. The Diet had been convoked for the 17th of June at Frankfurt. The day was drawing near, and which of the 2 parties had the majority was still regarded as uncertain. Franz von Sickingen appeared in the outskirts of Frankfurt with more than 20,000 men of the German army, whereat, marvellously astonished, says Fleurange, were they who wished well to the King of France, and very mightily rejoiced they who wished well to the Catholic King. The gentleman adventurer had not been less accessible than the prince-electors to bribery. The Diet opened on the 18th of June. The Archbishop of Mayence made a great speech in favour of Charles of Austria, and the Archbishop of Troves spoke in favour of Francis I, to whom he had remained faithful. Rival intrigues were kept up. Sickingen and his troops were a clog upon deliberation. The electors were embarrassed and weary of their dissensions, and the Archbishop of Troves proposed, by way of compromise, the election of the Duke of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, who at this crisis so shameful for his peers had just given fresh proofs of his sound judgment, his honesty, and his patriotic independence. But Frederick declined the honour it was intended to do him, and which he considered beyond his powers to support, and he voted for Archduke Charles, a real German prince, said he, the choice of whom seemed to him most natural in point of right and most suitable in point of fact under the present circumstances of Europe. The 6 other electors gave in to his opinion, and that same day, June 18, 1519, unanimously elected the King of Spain, Charles, King of the Romans and Emperor of Germany, with the title of Charles V. Whatever pains were taken by Francis I to keep up a good appearance after this heavy reverse, his mortification was profound, and he thought of nothing but getting his revenge. He flattered himself he would find something of the sort in a solemn interview and an appearance of alliance with Henry VIII, King of England, who had, like himself, just undergone in the election to the empire a less flagrant but an analogous reverse. It had already, in the previous year and on the occasion of a treaty concluded between the 2 kings for the restitution of Tournai to France, been settled that they should meet before long in token of reconciliation. Allusion had even been made at that period to a much more important restitution, of Calais in fact, for which Francis I, at what price we know not, had obtained the advocacy of Cardinal Wolsey, who was then all-powerful with Henry VIII. "Of what use to us," Wolsey had said, "is this town of Calais? where in time of peace as well as of war we have to keep up such numerous garrisons, which costs us so much money, and which so often forces us to measures contrary to the real interest of England? But this idea was vehemently scouted by the English, and the coming interview between the two kings remained the sole accessory of the Treaty of 1518. After Charles V.'s election to the empire, Francis I. was eager to claim this interview, which was sure to cause in Europe the impression of a close understanding between the two kings before the very eyes of their common rival. A convention, signed on the 26th of March 1520, regulated its details. It was stipulated that the two kings should meet in Picardy between Gien, an English possession in the neighbourhood of Calais, and Ardres, which belonged to France. But so soon as Charles V., at that time in Spain, was informed of this design, he used all his efforts to make it abortive. Henry, however, stood firm; not that he had resolved to knit himself closely with Francis I. against the new emperor, whom a few months previously he had shown alacrity in felicitating upon his accession to the empire, but he was unwilling to fail in his promise to the King of France, and he liked to assume in respect of the two rivals the part of an arbiter, equally courted by both. Charles V., still actively working against the interview, entered into secret negotiation with Cardinal Wolsey to obtain for himself also an interview with Henry VIII., which would destroy the effect of that in course of arrangement between the kings of France and England. In writing to Wolsey, he called him his very dear friend, and guaranteed him a pension of 7,000 ducats, secured upon 2 Spanish bishoprics; and on the 26th of May, 1520, Henry VIII. Received at Canterbury, as he was passing by on his way to embark at Dover for the interview in France, the, as it were, unexpected information that Charles V. had just arrived with his fleet at the port of Hythe. The king immediately sent Wolsey to meet the emperor, who disembarked at Dover, whither Henry went to visit him, and the two sovereigns repaired together to Canterbury, where they went in state to the cathedral, resplendent, says Erasmus, with all the precious gifts it had received for so many centuries, especially with the most precious of all, the chest containing the remains of Thomas a Becket, so magnificent that gold was the least of its ornaments. There they passed 3 days, treating of their affairs in the midst of galas, during which Charles V. completely won over Wolsey by promising to help him to become pope. On the 31st of May, 1520, Charles, quite easy about the interview in France, embarked at Sandwich for his Flemish possessions, and Henry VIII. Made sail for Calais, his point of departure to the place agreed upon for Francis to meet him, and where they had made up their minds, both of them, to display all the splendours of their two courts. This meeting has remained celebrated in history far more for its royal pomp, and for the personal incidents which were connected with it, than for its political results. It was called the Field of Cloth of Gold, and the courtiers who attended the two sovereigns felt bound to almost rival them in sumptuousness, insomuch, says the contemporary Martin du Bellay, that many bore thither their mills, their forests, and their meadows on their backs. Henry VIII. Had employed 1,100 workmen, the most skilful of Flanders and Holland, in building a quadrangle palace of wood, 128 feet long every way. On one side of the entrance gate was a fountain, covered with gilding, and surmounted by a statue of Bacchus, round which there flowed through subterranean pipes all sorts of wine, and which bore in letters of gold the inscription, "Make good cheer, who will," and on the other side a column, supported by 4 lions, was surmounted by a statue of Cupid armed with bows and arrows. Opposite the palace was erected a huge figure of a savage wearing the arms of his race, with this inscription, chosen by Henry VIII., "He whom I back wins." The frontage was covered outside with canvas painted to represent freestone, and the inside was hung with rich tapestries. Francis I., emulous of equalling his royal neighbour in magnificence, had ordered to be erected close to Ardres an immense tent, upheld in the middle by a colossal pole firmly fixed in ground and with pegs and cordage all around it. Outside, the tent, in the shape of a dome, was covered with cloth of gold, and inside it represented a sphere with a ground of blue velvet and studded with stars, like the firmament. At each angle of the large tent there was a small one equally richly decorated. But before the two sovereigns exchanged visits, in the midst of all these magnificent preparations, there arose a violent hurricane, which tore up the pegs and split the cordage of the French tent, scattered them over the ground, and forced Francis I. to take up his quarters in an old castle near Ardres. When the two kings' chief councillors, Cardinal Wolsey on one side and Admiral Bonnivet on the other, had regulated the formalities, on the 7th of June, 1520, Francis I. and Henry VIII. Set out on their way, at the same hour and the same pace, for their meeting in the valley of Ardres, where a tent had been prepared for them. As they drew near, some slight anxiety was manifested by the escort of the King of England, amongst whom a belief prevailed that that of the King of France was more numerous, but it was soon perceived to be nothing of the sort. The two kings, mounted upon fine horses and superbly dressed, advanced toward one another, and Henry VIII.'s horse stumbled, which his servants did not like. The two kings saluted each other with easy grace, exchanged embraces without getting off their horses, dismounted, and proceeded arm in arm to the tent where Wolsey and de Bonnivet were awaiting them. "My dear brother and cousin," immediately said Francis with his easy grace, "I am come a long way, and not without trouble, to see you in person. I hope that you hold me for such as I am, ready to give you aid with the kingdoms and lordships that are in my power." Henry, with a somewhat cold reserve, replied, "It is not your kingdoms or your divers possessions that I regard, but the soundness and loyal observance of the promises set down in the treaties between you and me. My eyes never beheld a prince who could be dearer to my heart, and I have crossed the seas at the extreme boundary of my kingdom to come and see you." The two kings entered the tent and signed a treaty whereby the Dauphin of France was to marry Princess Mary, only daughter at that time of Henry VIII., to whom Francis I. undertook to pay annually a sum of 100,000 livres, 2,800,000 francs, or 112,000 pounds in the money of our day, until the marriage was celebrated, which would not be for some time yet, as the English princess was only 4 years old. The two kings took wine together, according to custom, and reciprocally presented the members of their courts. "King Francis," says Henry VIII.'s favourite chronicler, Edward Hall, who was there, "is an amiable prince, proud in bearing and gay in manner, with a brown complexion, large eyes, long nose, thick lips, broad chest and shoulders, short legs, and big feet." Titian's portrait gives a loftier and a more agreeable idea of Francis I. When the two kings proceeded to sign in their tent the treaty they had just concluded, the King of England, according to Fleuranges' Memoirs, himself took up the articles and began to read them. When he had read those relating to the King of France, who was to have the priority, and came to speak of himself, he got as far as "I, Henry, King," he would have said "of France and England," but he left out the title as far as France was concerned, and said to King Francis, "I will not put it in as you are here, for I should lie," and he said only, "I, Henry, King of England." But as M. Mignet very properly says, if he omitted the title in his reading, he left it in the treaty itself, and shortly afterwards was ambitious to render it a reality, when he invaded France and wished to reign over it. Section 5.